Aloha, Kakao. Hi, everyone. It is Ajanette, and I am here to talk about Chapter 5. This week, we're going to be focused on professional ethics that impact us as human service professionals and social workers, and really ethics that may relate to any kind of profession where we're helping others or working with others. Um, Oops, sorry about that. So at the end of this module, you are going to learn about different types of ethical challenges and barriers that we face as human service professionals. So situations in which we might find ourselves as helping professionals where maybe there are contradictory values in place, or maybe our values are in contrast to the circumstances or situations. I am going to have you exploring your own personal values and understanding how that might drive your own sense of ethics and how that might impact some decisions that you're making as a professional. And I'm also going to introduce you to different strategies and steps that you can take to navigate these very precarious circumstances in which we find ourselves, where there may not be one clear answer, and we might face these very value-based challenges and dilemmas. So when we talk about human services, it's important to understand that sometimes the clear ethics that are outlined in our professional code of conduct or that we're taught in our classes, they may actually be in contrast to what we experience in our everyday job responsibilities. So there are times when just the reality of the work and the decisions that we're making might be in contrast to those ethics. And on the surface, it may seem like we have to violate our professional ethics. In reality, it's often contrasting values and ethics that are at play, right? It's not a black and white circumstance. The world is much more complex and diverse. I once had a friend that said, I used to talk about uh, the importance of being able to think in the gray, right? Because very rarely in life is a situation black and white and clear cut. So when you step into the gray, it allows you to understand the nuances, right? And how there are different situations that might have good and bad. And I had a friend who invited me to reframe it as not stepping into the gray, but instead stepping into the rainbow. Because the rainbow represents not just the diverse colors that exist, but the new colors that arise from the intersections and mixing of those colors. And that's kind of what our everyday work experience is like in the human services and social work profession, where we are living in the rainbow. We are working in the rainbow. Nothing is black and white. Sometimes there very much are competing and contrasting values and interests at stake. Sometimes where our job and responsibilities might be focused on efficiencies and bureaucracy and policies and regulations, we understand that those things might be impediments to actually getting the job done or serving the client well or supporting and meeting the needs of the client. So as professionals, we have to navigate those complexities. We have to understand that right and wrong may not be as clear cut and simple, and we have to have principles that help guide our work and help us feel good about the decisions that we make and the work that we do. So I present this as a question: can workers be completely unbiased? And I'm actually telling you the answer to that question is absolutely not. We cannot be unbiased. As human beings, we all have bias. Bias is universal. It doesn't mean we're bad. It doesn't mean we're evil. It doesn't mean we're prejudiced. It means that we are shaped by the norms and values around us uh, at an individual level, at a family level, at a cultural level, at a societal level, right? And our values are influenced by our various nuanced identities, by our gender, by our social class, by our ethnicity and our race, and the experiences that we have as a result of those identities and the ways in which they intersect, and the perceptions that are created based on those experiences, right? It's also important to note that those things influence our values. They influence our biases, our values. They influence our worldviews and the ways in which we make sense of the world and the people around us and the experiences that shape us. Based on all of that, it's impossible to be objective because we have our own identities, our own experiences as a result of those identities, our own perceptions as a result of those identities, and consequently, our own values. Now, it's important to note that those values may change over our lifetime, right? We might have new experiences and new perceptions emerge as we go through life, and it might cause us to call into question values that we once held dear. Either way, as individual human beings, we all have differences, right? And based on those differences, we have different attitudes and perceptions, and views, political views, religious views. We have different attitudes about culture and social class and gender and all these other complexities that make us uniquely us. And so we can't escape bias, but what we can do is become extrinsically aware of those implicit biases. What is unconscious, we can bring to our consciousness. And sometimes we can actually help to combat and address those biases, but most importantly, we really want to recognize those biases so we can understand how they might be influencing the decisions that we're making and counter those decisions. We don't want to be making decisions based on our automatic assumptions, but rather our thoughtful, explicit, intentional analysis of those circumstances and the ways in which our bias might be influencing our perceptions. So when we talk about a values dilemma, we're really talking about situations where there is no right or wrong answer. There's no clear-cut solution. And so consequently, we might have option A, B, C, or D, all of which may have value and merit. They all might have pros and cons. And so we're consistently kind of balancing and weighing the pros and cons. We're consistently doing this analysis of, do the costs outweigh the benefits, or do the benefits outweigh the cost? And so we call it a cost benefit analysis. And as a human services professional and as a social worker, you are kind of that balancing act for many situations where maybe some of the policies at play may be in stark contrast to what's in the best interest of the client. And you have to weigh that situation individually, because how you weigh the facts of that case may be different than an outcome that was decided on a previous case. Maybe that solution was right for that client, but a different solution is warranted for another client based on the individual nuances and fact pattern. So we're consistently needing to kind of question the decisions that we make. And here are some ways that we can kind of guide that decision-making process. Ask yourself these questions as you're making decisions for these situations where there's no right or wrong answer, right? What values are promoted by the action that you take? So you've gone through and you've analyzed the circumstances, you've gathered the evidence, you've weighed the pros and cons, and you think you're going to make this decision, Plan A. What values are promoted by Plan A? What are the benefits? What values are reflected? How are your biases and values reflected in that decision? And how are the values of your clients reflected in that decision? What values are violated by that decision? If you take that course of action, then how might that be in contrast to other values that guide you personally as a professional, or maybe guide your clients? Is the client capable of making those decisions? And if not, what's the appropriate way to make the decision? How might we best integrate the client or at least center the client in that decision, right? How are we defining their ability and competence to be included in that decision? Are we respecting and valuing their self-determination, their autonomy, their individual rights and values, and are we considering how those might be in contrast to our own? How do positions of power and that power imbalance between us as a human services professional and social worker and the client? We have authority over people's lives, and we have to consider how that power imbalance might be influencing these decisions. We have institutional authority that might, in fact, change the course of someone's life forever. And that then has subsequent consequences to other human beings. So we need to really be intentional and mindful of that power differentiation, a differential, and how that is influencing the decisions we're making. Are there other decisions that we should consider? If we're thinking about all the possible decisions and alternatives on the table, what are the pros and cons of those alternatives? And why might the benefits of the decision you're making outweigh the pros and cons of the alternatives? And then how are your own personal values influencing your decision-making process? How are they influencing how you're valuing the pros and cons of plan A over plan B, C, D, or Z, right? Think about how your colleagues might come to another decision, how that might be a perfectly reasonable decision. Think about how others might be evaluating and considering the basis of those decisions. So it's really important if you go through this in a very intentional and thoughtful way, and you are centering the client at the core, not your own personal values, not what you think is right or wrong, but the client's needs and well-being. If you're making client-centered decisions, then even if there is no clear solution, even if it is a rainbow solution, then you're going to be able to look yourself in the mirror and you're going to be able to sleep well at night and know that you made the best decision possible with the information that you had, that you truly felt like served the client's best interest. And that is a good decision, even if it has drawbacks, even if it's in contrast with other values. So let's talk a little bit more about bias. And I'm actually going to have you dive into an activity this week that allows you to think about your implicit bias, think about your unconscious bias, to go through a practice and activity that is widely accepted as a way of kind of assessing what our biases are in various areas. And I'm going to have you pick 3 key areas in which you're explicitly analyzing your unconscious bias. When we talk about conscious, right, like we know it, we're very much aware of it. Others are likely aware of our bias, right? Like let's take, I have a bias toward the Lakers. I grew up in the LA area in California. I'm very biased toward the Lakers. I might have an unconscious bias. I will say, I haven't often thought about ability and how ability shapes my teaching, right? I make assumptions that everybody can see or everybody can hear. And so consequently, I may not fully understand other ways of describing what I'm presenting visually so that people that that don't have the same visual abilities, right, can still experience the value of what I'm sharing visually. And so that might be an unconscious bias of mine. But I want you to know that everyone has unconscious bias. Everyone. It's universal across the globe, no matter your culture, age, gender, doesn't matter. We all have unconscious bias. Because our perceptions of the world and our brain, honestly, as a psychologist, I can tell you that the way in which we organize information is categorically. Our brain automatically categorizes things. It creates constructs. And these constructs help us to organize our information and understanding of the world, our knowledge. So grouping information is kind of normal. Creating some kind of generalized expectations or descriptions of that information in the group is a normal process that our brain automatically goes through. It's part of our information processing and our memory consolidation. So I want you to know that it's not good or bad, right? It's just a way in which our brains function efficiently. So it is universal. However, we also have to be mindful that it's varied. It also informs the attitudes that we have toward those categories, how we value those different categories or the characteristics, which may or may not be consistent with the characteristics someone else defines for that category. And it may or may not be accurate or objective. And so we have to be aware of our biases, and that self-awareness is essential because that's the way that we can combat them. When we're doing things automatically and quickly and in a hurry, then what happens is those unconscious biases really take hold and drive our decision making. But if we're self-aware of our biases and we stop and we're more deliberate and intentional about evaluating the decisions we're making and the bias that might be influencing those decisions, then we can counter that bias. We can negate that bias. We can make sure that we're considering alternative viewpoints and perspectives and try again to center the client instead of defaulting to the way in which we see the world or have seen the world up until this point in our lives. Another reason why it's so important to make client-centered decisions is this notion of self-determination, which is one of the key values in our code of ethics as professionals, right? The NASW, the National Association for Social Workers, thinks this is so critical and important. It actually is at the center of our very first code of ethic, and that is social workers should respect and promote the right of clients to self-determination and assist clients in their efforts to identify and clarify their goals. These aren't our goals. These aren't our lives. These are our clients' goals and lives. So it is so important that we center their values, their voices, them in the decision-making process. What we do, consistent with this next part of the code of ethic, social workers may limit clients' right to self-determination when, in the social worker professional's judgment, clients' actions or potential actions pose a serious, foreseeable, and imminent risk to themselves or others. We absolutely have the power and authority to limit clients' rights to their own self-determination. Our positions do that every day. Whether we are a parole officer, probation officer, and we are giving authority and permission to the clients that we're serving to do or not do certain things, to live or not live in certain places, to have or not have certain jobs. Whether we are offering, people applying for benefits, access to, food resources or cash resources, whether we are taking a child from their home or not, right? Whether we're requiring parents to engage in mandated treatment, we absolutely are taking away self-determination. And sometimes that can be at odds. Sometimes that can be, a very challenging ethical situation. It is 100% ethical when we're doing that because the client's actions are posing a risk to themselves or others, right? That's when it's ethical for us to take away self-determination. Otherwise, we should do everything in our power to make sure that we are honoring self-determination as best as possible within those circumstances. It's really important to consider the various roles that you may hold in this profession, whether it's in mental health, whether it's in juvenile justice or criminal justice, whether it's in child protective services, whether it's in the foster care system, whatever it might be. There are circumstances in which you have authority over people's lives. It's important to try to make sure they are part of those decisions whenever possible. Let's talk about child abuse for a bit. So child abuse may be a situation where we very much might be facing some ethical challenges, right? And where our own views and beliefs might be in contrast to the law, that might be in contrast to what we know empirically to be in the best interest of children, whatever it might be. But in terms of child abuse, it's directly related to how we view parenting and parenting rights, right? And there are different views and ideologies about parenting. Some people consider them to be very sacred personal rights. And you should not tell me how to parent my child or how not to parent my child, right? Other people feel like it's society and government's role to ensure that our children are protected. And so parents don't have full liberties because those might be in contrast or in opposition to the rights and protections of the child. We also have very different views on how involved should government be, right? Some people believe in big government and appropriate regulation to ensure a healthy functioning society where everyone's rights are protected. Some people believe in small government and individual choice, right? And asserting the rights of parental rights. But then those can be in contrast with parental and child rights. And so all of these different ideologies are at play when you, as a human service professional or as a social worker, need to make a decision and an assessment and judgment about, is this parenting or is this abuse, right? And this is particularly difficult when we, as professionals and as agencies and institutions, face lawsuits. We're in a very litigious society here in America, and the decisions or actions that we take or don't take might actually find us in a lawsuit. And that might kind of inspire fear in the decisions that we're making. Again, I'm going to go back to making a thoughtful, intentional decision. I'm going to go back to going through those motions of evaluating and centering the needs of the client. And at this point, you might have two clients. You might have a child, and you might have a parent. And you have to really think about the well-being of both. Of course, you have to focus on centering the health and safety of most often the child. There are certainly cases where children can abuse their parents, but most often the children are at risk of being abused, and you have to center their safety and well-being first, regardless of whether you feel like you're going to be sued as a result of the decision that you're making. Know that you've weighed out those decisions thoughtfully, and you're making the best decision given the information that you have at the moment. And do your due diligence to find all the relevant information as you're making these critical decisions. In terms of child abuse, sometimes the laws aren't clear. They don't, in most states, right, they don't clearly define what constitutes child abuse. And this is very intentional on the part of our legislators because they don't want to cross those gray areas and upset one particular area of their constituents that might vote them out of office, right? And unfortunately, what that does is that puts us in a difficult predicament. That puts the burden of the decision on us, where there is no clear-cut definition and guidelines for child abuse. And there's multiple values at play. And so we have to make a decision. In a country that values parental rights, And in a country that has largely relied on corporal punishment, we have to say, is it really discipline or is it abuse? And without clear-cut laws, that becomes an individual decision that has to be made based on the fact pattern of each individual case. In some cases, it may be clear, and in other cases, it may not be, and that decision's left with you. So you have to weigh those decisions carefully. Know that in many other westernized countries, developed countries, this isn't the case. There's very clear-cut laws and bans on corporal punishment because there's a tremendous amount of empirical research that shows the negative effects of corporal punishment. The research is very clear. The psychological research, the sociological research, it's very clear that corporal punishment can have very negative effects on children's psychological health and well-being. And it often, it is the precedent for many child abuse cases. However, it's still legal in all 50 states. Our laws aren't always informed by the research. They don't always make clear-cut laws based on what the science tells us, right? And that's not necessarily always a good thing. But that being said, it is the world in which we operate. And so that burden, again, falls on you as human service professionals. So if you're working in CPS, and many of us might, I actually think it's good for each of us to work in the field or in another field that closely relates or intersects with CPS, so that we can understand the complexity and so we can have a broader view and appreciation for what our colleagues do in the field. But CPS has to go out and investigate allegations of abuse, and those occur across all social, levels of social class, gender, ethnicities, and we have to evaluate as professionals, are we making reasonable decisions? Are we assessing it objectively and fairly? CPS has disproportionate data. The data shows disproportionate levels of children of color being taken away from their parents. So in cases where white families are accused of abuse compared to those of families of color, the children from families of color are significantly more likely to be taken away than our Caucasian families. Same is true in terms of wealth. In allegations of abuse in wealthy families, they are more likely to be left in the home than in families that are suffering economically. And so we have to be mindful how bias is at play in those decisions that we're making, right? And if you're intentional about reflecting on your own bias, then you're more likely to come to the decision that you're making the best possible decision based on the facts of the case and centering the needs of the clients, the children first and foremost, and the parents in the decisions that you're making. Another area in which we might be compromising self-determination is when we're mandating treatment, right? And this is done in a number of areas that affect the human service field, right? Where a court may mandate someone to substance abuse treatment. They may mandate them to AA or NA. And that can be at odds with our ethics. Now, we certainly know as professionals when you're talking about substance abuse, most people aren't going to be able to get clean until they're committed and willing to get clean. Many people will find that when they are impacted by the justice system, that is a very wake-up call for them, a sobering event for them. And so they are motivated to get clean. And so there's tremendous success that might come through this mandated substance abuse treatment. However, for many, because it's being imposed upon them and they're not in a position where they're ready to get clean yet, and then it may not be successful and they're still going to relapse. And I think it's important to understand that relapse is part of the recovery process, right? Substance abuse is a very complex circumstance that has biological factors at play, including genetics, including chemical imbalances, including brain structures. And so there's all kinds of biological mechanisms that support addictive, uh, circumstances. There's also psychological mechanisms at play, social mechanisms at play. And so it's very complex. So I always encourage my abnormal psychology or when I'm teaching clinical psych or psychological disorders, I always encourage my students to recognize their judgments and biases that they have toward these clients and to try to approach the field and the clients with a perspective of compassion, empathy. Um, you know, caffeine use. Caffeine is actually the substance that has the highest rates of addiction, and we all kind of like use caffeine in some way or another in our lives, right? Most, I shouldn't say all, many people. And so we can relate to, oh, I can't live without my coffee in the morning, or maybe I can't live without my sugar, or I can't live without my Coke, or whatever it might be, you know, whether you're a soda drinker or not. And so that's one way that you might be able to develop a sense of empathy and compassion for somebody relying on a little bit more, um, you know, uh, stigmatized substance. Also, we mandate counseling and therapy. I actually worked with sex offenders where these sex offenders, as a condition of their parole, were required to work with this psychologist that I worked with. And so we had weekly group sessions and we met with these sex offenders. Now they recognized that we had authority over their freedom, right? So do you think they were being entirely truthful and disclosing their full intentions and desires and thoughts with us? Likely not, right? Because if they shared with us that they had desires, toward a child in their now, their new role in society outside of the justice system, then that psychologist would actually report that to their parole officer, and their parole would be revoked, and they'd find themselves back in jail. So there's limitations on what counseling or therapy can do when it's under the context of mandated therapy. That being said, I still found value in it. I did find value in them gaining a sense of self-awareness and learning tools and strategies and coping mechanisms to kind of combat their impulsive desires. I found other ways in which we could facilitate and foster personal growth in them and teach them to value other things and to find other motivations and purpose and drives in life that help to distract them and take them away from their sexual deviant thoughts, right? I've also been part of mandated parenting classes, and sadly, a lot of people may not fully understand how a child develops. They may not understand how certain parenting approaches may not be effective for the cognitive or social and emotional development of the child at any given developmental period. And so parenting classes sometimes need to be coupled with just an overall understanding of child development. And depending upon who's leading those classes, they may or may not have that background or that knowledge to share and impress upon parents. Sometimes parents might be just going through the motions and jumping through the hoops and not truly seeking to be better parents. Sometimes education alone can make them better parents. So there's pros and cons. I've also worked with domestic violence perpetrators through anger management classes. And I've learned that anger is not the only motivation for, domestic violence and family conflict, and that it's not also one-sided, that often this is a dynamic within the family where um, both partners have poor communications, poor coping strategies, poor self-awareness. And so anger management with the alleged perpetrator alone may not be sufficient. There might be a need to have family interventions or conjoint family therapy or strategies where the children who are traumatized by those circumstances need their own care, where both partners need individual and maybe even joint care, because quite often these perpetrators return to their families, right? And it may not just be a one-way violence. They might be engaging in violence against one another. So all parties need to be addressed. And then there's mandated medication and hospitalization, right? When we pull someone in for a hold, a mental health hold, because they're a threat to themselves or others, sometimes we mandate that they take medication, or that we treat them for delusions or hallucinations, or that we treat them for emotional outrage, or bipolar conditions, or various circumstances if they're experiencing a manic episode or any other kind of emotional response that we deem to be unhealthy. We can actually mandate medication. And is that violating their right to self-determination, right? NAMI would say yes, absolutely. Patients should have a right to determine what treatment they want to pursue. We definitely have a plethora of research that shows that pharmaceutical industries and companies make billions and trillions of dollars off medicating people. Those medications have side effects. Those side effects may undermine someone's ability to have a quality of life. So there's all these ethical dilemmas wrapped up in all of these mandated approaches. And we have to be mindful how our decisions are involved in these ethical decisions and how we're impacted by them. We also have to think about coercion overall. So, as human service professionals and as social workers, we are involved in coercive relationships just by nature of the power that we hold over these clients. That's coercion, right? Think about your teacher. When your teacher is saying they want something, they need you to do something, right? They have the power over your grade, which ultimately has the power over whether you get to advance toward your career, which might ultimately decide whether or not, you can make an income and support the needs of your family. All of that is coercive. When I hold power over you and I now can influence the decisions that you make because you're afraid of my authority over you, that's a coercive relationship. And so it's important for us as professionals to acknowledge that, to recognize the power we hold over people's lives, to never take it for granted, to never wield it freely against someone, right? But to instead walk in those shoes with humility, with grace, with reverence, right? And with a desire to always put the client's needs at the forefront of our decision making. It's really important that while we want to maybe try to educate our clients and encourage them to make better choices with their lives, to make more informed choices and empowered choices, we want to be careful that we're not manipulating them, that we're not in any way limiting the self-determination beyond what the circumstances already limit. And so instead of being, manipulative and covert about our intentions, have explicit conversations with the clients. Be proactive about educating the clients. Share the rationale and approach and the process in your decision making, and give them as much information as is appropriate so they can make an informed choice and maybe even offer informed consent as best as possible, right? Sometimes There is no consent. They have to do what we require of them. But at least giving them some choice in those decisions, right? If we're going to require drug treatment, talk to them about what their options are and what may best align with their values or their needs. Give them some choice in the circumstance. And when that's not possible, at least explain the decisions and the options and the process by which you came to the decision. Be upfront and transparent. And that is the best thing that we can do to try to make sure we're not manipulating or coercing the client given the situation. So I want to talk about some examples of ethical dilemmas that we face in our field, right? So this historically, we had limited knowledge about HIV and AIDS, and we didn't understand the risks, and we often excluded individuals and children from accessing who were diagnosed with HIV or AIDS, from accessing just regular social services, whether it's education or medical care or whatever. There's conflict about needle distribution programs in our unhoused population or in our population of individuals who are struggling with drug use and abuse, right? There's controversies about condom distribution and should we be offering free condoms to society at whole, to children, to teens in schools. And there's controversy over health education. Do we educate children, teens, even seniors about HIV? So some of these things are presented as ethical dilemmas and challenges. But again, if you go to the empirical research and you look at the data and you say, okay, well, where are there more positive outcomes? Then maybe that can offer some guidance in our views and perceptions. So dig into the research, find the empirical data, look at the benefits of sex education in high school. Look at the benefits of clean needle distributions and how that might impact, HIV and HIV and other diseases, and the rates of those diseases in communities where they do have access to clean needles and where they don't. Another area that falls under our purview is maybe euthanasia, especially those that might be going into medical social work or might be in any kind of human service professional. If you're working in a nursing home or if you're working in elder care or you're a hospice worker, you might be exposed to individuals who no longer want to endure the pain. They want to end their lives. They want to choose the method by which they leave this world, and they want some dignity and they want to preserve their dignity in how they leave the world. They don't want to be in a position of dependence on others. And so we have these ethical dilemmas. Well, how is that different from suicide, right? How much authority should they have to make those decisions over themselves? Do we call it euthanasia or assisted suicide? All of the language that we use and the ways in which we talk about these things or we educate ourselves and others about these things reflects our biases. We should know that there are states, so if you're going to be working or living in any of these states, this might impact your profession. And if your personal values are at odds with it, then you have to recognize you have to honor the laws. But in Oregon, California, Seattle, Vermont, Colorado, and the District of Columbia, it is legal to support someone in ending their lives and to have physicians involved in that process. And there's criteria that has to be met, and that criteria differs depending upon the state. Most often they need 2 or more physicians that support the process, that most often it involves a psychological assessment to make sure that they're of sound mind and they are competent to make that decision. And there's usually, a time frame and a process that they have to go through in order to be granted the authority, the legal authority to make that decision. We're also definitely dealing with reproductive rights in our national conversation right now, especially with the recent Supreme Court ruling and how that has removed universal protections associated with Roe versus Wade. And we are now seeing states across the country that are enacting very restrictive laws that limit reproductive rights and that limit and outlaw abortion and that have legal consequences not just to an individual seeking an abortion, but also the medical staff and professionals. And so you have medical providers who are no longer offering the care, which goes against the American Medical Association Code of Ethics, right? So now you have all these different ethics at odds with one another. You also have some states trying to restrict birth control and who has access to it and what birth control they have access to. And you have the counter position that now violates my bodily autonomy and me being able to decide what decisions I can make for my body. You also have circumstances related to sterilization. I had a student just this week talking to me, and they're in their 20s, late 20s. They don't want to have children. They are a woman, and they have talked to their doctor about having a hysterectomy, and their doctor refuses. Their health insurance won't cover it. They're A, too young, B, not married, that the rationale is that what if they get married and their spouse wants to have children? And what that the message that's being sent here is that, and this is a woman who's being told that a husband might want to have children. So there's the heteronormativity there. There's also this, implication that somehow a man should have the right to decide for me whether or not I want children. And so there's a lot of ethics and questions surrounding that decision. Then there's also privacy issues at play. Should parents be notified when when minors are seeking abortions, when they're seeking birth control? Should spouses be notified? And some laws have determined no, that's a constitutional violation. Other states have upheld those restrictions. So it's really important. You should know the laws in your area where you're going to be working and living. And going to school, by the way. Like if you're transferring to a university in another state, you should understand what laws and restrictions are in place in that state, because that may or may not impact you while you're a student, or maybe if you have a child going out of state that's continuing their education out of state. It's important to be informed, right? It's also important to do your own examination. And are you imposing your personal values on your clients? Maybe you don't believe in abortion, but a client wants an abortion. Are you taking the appropriate steps and doing everything in your power to honor that client's right and self-determination to make that decision? Or are you putting up barriers? Are you doing everything in your power to maybe manipulate them and coerce them out of that decision because it doesn't align with what you think to be the right decision? So those are all things that you have to think about as a human service professional. You have to be able to put your personal values and views aside and help the client, and again, center the client in the decisions that you're making and the steps that you're taking to support their overall well-being. Another area where we find ourselves in challenging ethics is as it relates to sex offenders. I mentioned that I worked with sex offenders. And these were individuals who were convicted of sex offenses, and most of them were registered sex offenders. And unfortunately, many of them struggled with finding a place to live. They couldn't even go to family homes because either A, the victim of the abuse was in the family, or B, they were exposed to other minors within the family, and so that was a violation of their parole conditions. But because of Megan's Law and the public access to know where these sex offenders are living or when they might be in a community, many communities protested them living there, or they harassed them. And so they were not able to, or I don't want to say they weren't able, it was a struggle to find a place where they could live and where they could rehabilitate. Some don't ever believe sex offenders are capable of rehabilitation. And that becomes problematic because that bias then is going to influence how you interact with those clients, right? If you do not believe that they can be rehabilitated, that they can be helped, and you believe that, they're sex offenders for life and they'll never be able to curb those urges, then you may not offer them the most supportive care if you're supervising them in any way. And that can be, again, challenging and problematic. That being said, it's also important to know that these laws were put in place as a means of protecting society and in particular protecting children. Megan's Law has a very tragic case that inspired the law, where a young girl was abused, um, and the family had no clue that she was at risk. The family had no clue who was living in their community. And so, the law has very good intentions. It's very healthy to have that knowledge so you can take the steps you need to take. And there's that ethical dilemma, like we're protecting society, but what about the constitutional rights of these individuals to rehabilitate and recover, right? Uh, and so, you know, the that is an important dilemma to consider. I also want you to think about the law also can't always protect us because we have this notion of stranger danger. That's a bias. That's what society has conditioned us to think, that, when we're walking down a street at night, that we're at risk of being raped. But they don't always talk to us about the fact that the greater risk lies within our own family. We're more likely to be abused by someone that we know. Perpetrators are most often a father, a brother, an uncle, a stepfather, a friend of the family, a coach, someone that we know, that we trust, that we invite into our home. And so that's really important to know too. And because of that personal connection, abuse is often unreported. So we have extremely low numbers. And and we have to consider that maybe the ways in which we're explicitly trying to deal with sex offenders isn't really addressing the main source of the problem. Chemical castration is another solution that's thrown out there and utilized by some states where, again, they're mandated to take medication, and there becomes that ethical dilemma about that as well. So often society interests in protecting safety and well-being of society and our children is at odds with the civil liberties of those offenders. Okay, we're going to talk about two other areas that weren't really talked about in the book, but these are kind of at the forefront of national conversations right now, so I just wanted to throw them out there. Gender identity is a huge conversation that's happening, and there's major ethical dilemmas at play. Again, it's often this conflict of parental rights versus child rights. There's also the underlying notion of LGBTQ rights. And is an individual being treated as a human? Are they, given the dignity and value as a human, or are they being very much othered and objectified? We often see individuals that have expansive gender identities being represented as perpetrators, as abusers, as sexual deviants. They shouldn't have access to a restroom that aligns with their gender identity, because then that puts other, let's say, little girls at risk of being sexually abused in the bathroom. In reality, an individual that's transgender, particularly a transgender woman of color, is statistically more likely to be assaulted, abused, and even murdered than any other social group. And so there is very little data showing that they are the abusers, and tremendous data showing they are victimized. And so that's really important to understand that. If you look at the data, we talk a lot about what ifs, what ifs, what ifs. But if you look at the data of actual occurrences and the statistics on that data, or excuse me, the statistics on those occurrences, it's often the transgender individual that's targeted. Should they have access to medical care? Should minors have access to medical care? Who should be paying for that medical care? We see in the justice system, we often see them having access to therapy, having access to hormone treatment, having access to even surgical intervention. And society says, I don't want my money paying for it. But is it ethical to have an individual who's very much feminized, identifies as a woman, in a prison with men where they are sexually abused? Is that ethical, right? Should they participate in sports or not sports? Should they have to compete with individuals of their sex assigned at birth, or should they be able to play soccer, on a team that's with other individuals that align with the gender, their gender identity? So all of these things are in conversation and in question right now, and a big thing is what's happening in schools right now. I do want to just share with you that LGBTQ individuals, which includes transgender individuals, are actually more likely to be abused and rejected within their own families. They're more likely to be homeless as a result. They're more likely to be victims of sex trafficking as a result. They're more likely to be victims of assault and murder, kidnapping, because they're vulnerable, right? When their own families reject them, they're vulnerable. And so they are often abused within their own homes, whether it's physical or psychological abuse. They are often subject to abuse. And so notifying parents of their differing identities and expansive identifies might actually put them at risk of being abused. Or, notifying, anybody without their consent could jeopardize them. And so that's really important to weigh those ethics and those challenges. And again, think about your own personal biases as you're navigating situations, if you're a school social worker, or if you're a counselor of any sorts that's working with teens, or you're working in an after-school program. These are situations that you might find yourself, or dilemmas you might find yourself facing. Another issue I want to bring kind of to our attention that's not addressed in the book is marijuana, right? Marijuana has been legalized in many states, and it's still very much criminalized in others. In fact, in the states in which it has been legalized, even for recreational use, there are still people sitting in jail for criminal convictions related to marijuana, which is now legal, right? So it would be like people sitting in jail for drinking alcohol when it's very much legal to drink alcohol now. And some would say that is an ethical dilemma and challenged, right? Challenge. So, should we be overturning previous convictions related to marijuana? What about states where there's a three strikes law and that third conviction resulted in lifetime incarceration? How do we address those situations? Um, should it be legalized or not legalized, especially in light of new empirical research that shows that it might actually put you at increased risk of heart attack and stroke? But hold on, there's also research that shows the negative effects of nicotine and alcohol, and yet those substances are legal. Why are those substances legal and these other substances aren't legal? Where does the wealth and power and control come in that's influencing this legislation? So there's all kinds of ethical challenges that are happening behind the scenes, and there's all kinds of power dynamics and political dynamics happening behind the scenes that are influencing these situations and how society is operating within these circumstances. And that's the case for all of these issues, right? Not just marijuana, but for all of these issues. Who is making the decisions? What is influencing the decisions that they're made? Who is funding those decisions, that research? And is it truly objective, unbiased research and decision making? So the bottom line is we are always at odds in our profession. We are always in situations where there are conflicting views, right? And potentially conflicting ethics. And that kind of really reflects the larger oppositional views in society about human nature overall, right? Some people, and if you look historically, particularly in the field of psychology, sociology, if you look historically, how American society was created, right? We definitely have this constitution that values our individual rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And we consider these to be inalienable rights. They transcend our human understanding, and they're just things that are granted to us just by nature of existing and breathing. But at the same time, our Constitution doesn't guarantee us any provisions. There is no guaranteed job, there's no guaranteed income, there's no guaranteed life or home or means by which we can secure these rights, by which we can achieve and honor these rights of individuals, right? And so that's kind of at odds. And then you look at some underlying values of society, and we'll talk more about this in the next couple of slides, but how we value individualistic values as opposed to collectivist values. And we have this very Protestant work ethic. And so that makes us question the role of public services, right? Should government provide welfare, social security, public health? We're debating about, should we have access to universal health care? Should we have access to universal income? Should we have access to universal child care? Should our elderly automatically be in homes and in communities where their needs are being met and taken care of? Does society have a responsibility to take care of its citizens? And sure, maybe I believe so, but I don't want to have to pay for it. Someone has to pay for it. So where does that come from? Do we value the role of taxes and social intervention in taking care of and supporting social good? Or do we view it as handouts? Do we view it as it's that person's role and responsibility? And I would say, if you look at us on a global scale, the United States is actually most or least likely to offer these types of universal benefits to all of society. Wealthiest nation in the world, and yet we also have some of the lowest benefits. We value capitalism and individual profit more so than collective and overall social well-being. So those are things to think about. If you look at historically some of the different philosophers and some of the different views, it kind of reflects some of the underlying factors that contribute to these value systems that are currently in play or currently in question. Thomas Hobbes really believed that government needed to regulate society in order to protect social order and keep society civilized. And so therefore this view promotes kind of big government, promotes regulation, promotes governmental authority, and really sticks to a law and order approach. And they don't really believe in individual self-regulation and individual good, and they look at a need for someone to maintain that social order, right? And maybe you have these values. And so maybe you believe in kind of a more restrictive approach to working with clients, and you are more controlling in your approach, and maybe you have them, meet certain criteria or requirements before you issue them different benefits, right? Because you're quote unquote regulating them, because you're assuring them, assuring that they are meeting their obligations, right? So you have to think about those things. John Locke came along and said, oh, actually, people are innately good. We will innately follow a self-interest that drives us toward a positive and just society. So we will make decisions that not only support our best interests, but though ultimately the best interest of society as a whole. He didn't think that babies were born selfish and kind of evil, maybe consistent with how others, such as Freud, may have said, right? He believed that we're blank slates. We come into the world kind of pure, and our experience in the environment shapes us. So we can shape individuals to be committed to social good, that overall they actually will make choices that align with what's in the best interest of society as a whole. Overall, there's always exceptions, right? And if this is the case, then maybe in your role, you want to make sure you're providing resources or activities or opportunities or interventions that help to educate and shape and create an environment that's rich and plentiful for your clients. So if you hold these values, it'll be reflected in the way that you serve clients. Jean-Jacques Rousseau believed also that people were good by nature, right? That we weren't inherently bad, but society does shape us and sometimes it corrupts us, right? And he suggested that education was necessary to really help us achieve self-actualization or our full potential, right? That education was there to present us with knowledge and give us opportunity to fully realize who we are as human beings. But those decisions are ours to make. Paulo Freire is actually a very well-known and well-respected sociologist, and we value him in education because he really helps us to examine the ways in which our identities influence our experience and perceptions. And so he suggested that education should help us become more conscientious of those identities and help us to raise questions and engage in critical thinking about the identities and circumstances in our lives that might shape how we're perceiving the information, that might shape the pre-existing views that we come with, that might shape what we do with what we're learning and how we might adopt it or reject it. And so when we're more conscientious about understanding our identities and how it contributes to our current circumstances and how it influences our engagement with education and benefits potentially of that education, then we can definitely, again, work to counter those barriers and adopt mindsets and strategies that can be more helpful and empowering for us moving forward. There's also feminist perspectives that arose in the 60s, and we started to see feminism and women's studies and gender studies emerge in academia and in the research. And Carol Gilligan and Jean Baker Miller are two very prominent theorists in our feminist history. And feminism, unlike what some people believe, some people think that feminists means you're a man hater. That is not the case. Feminists actually support kind of not just equal rights, but they really support the well-being of all. They value more collectivist approaches versus individualistic, where I'm thinking about me and my individual success, and they really focus more on moving away from that kind of competitive structure where it's all about how can I get ahead, and thinking about actually how can we all benefit? How can we all advance? How can I support not just my rights, but the rights of others that maybe share my identities or have other identities or maybe intersectional identities? So I don't just care about women's rights. I care about LGBTQ rights. I care about civil rights for other people based on ethnicity, race, culture, economic status. So I'm not just focused on women's rights. I'm really focused on human rights. That's what a feminist is. And so I think people need to, again, break through the myths or misconceptions that they might have from popular press ideologies and really come to understand what the feminist field itself has contributed in terms of research, ideologies, philosophies, and how the field defines itself and the work that it has produced and the benefits of that work. Again, don't listen to the secondary information. Focus on the primary information. Judge feminism based on the work of the feminists within the field directly instead of someone else's interpretation of that work. And that should be the case with every view, right? But at the core of feminism, we've had society tell us from day one, men and women are inherently different. But feminism doesn't necessarily subscribe to that. We actually focus not just on differences, but our similarities, how we might be alike, how we might face similar challenges, and how maybe subscribing to those old views might actually cause more division and more strife, both within ourselves personally and society as a whole. So Carol Gilligan overall felt that women do make decisions not just about, not just in terms of how it's going to affect us, but how it's going to affect others. I know as I make decisions as a mom, as a teacher, as a colleague, even in the voting booth, right? I don't just think about me. I think about what impact this has on others. How is this going to affect my children? How is this going to impact my students? How is this going to impact my colleagues, other faculty, society as a whole? And so this is a very different way than the individualistic view that really teaches us to focus on us, right? Self-reliance. Jean Baker Miller also suggested that a lot of our feminine traits, many of which that have been socialized, right? Like nurturing, caring, loving, affectionate, compassion, those are socialized. Men can actually be just as nurturing, just as caring, just as compassionate, just as empathetic. However, society doesn't socialize them to be that way. It actually may even socialize them to repress their emotions, to repress that nurturing side, because it's taught to be feminine and somehow inferior to being strong and confident and empowered. And so we have to be mindful of the messages that we're sending people And what she says is those feminine traits, although socialized, they're actually strengths. They're actually valuable. They make us better human beings and better leaders, and they are traits of empowerment. We don't need to dominate and control. They help us work in community and partnership with one another. And research has actually shown that leaders that utilize those traits, whether they're women or not, but if they utilize those traits that are thought to be more feminine oriented, they actually have greater success and greater outcomes. Team building rather than competition and dominance and control. Either way, we still operate in this bureaucracy, right? Bureaucracy is inherent in public social service, right? In public service. So most of the work that we do, if we're working for any kind of state-funded agency, and even a lot of our private agencies that we work for and the nonprofits that we work for get grants from public sources. So bureaucracy is still involved in that. Bureaucracy comes with it practices, procedures, regulations, rules, reports, and mandates. And sometimes those are contrary to the needs of clients. Even grants, right? They come with all these restrictions and requirements. And they might say you have to have this percentage of the funds directed toward A, right? And it might be best to meet the client needs by directing it towards something entirely different. But we are forced and restricted and bound by those requirements of the funding. So sometimes the barriers of these regulations, of these restrictions and rules and requirements can be directly oppositional to what we know is in the best interest of clients. Sometimes they might restrict us and they might be barriers for us to actually meet the needs of clients. Sometimes they might put us in very unethical circumstances, or they might put us in conflicts. And so you have to decide how you're going to navigate that, right? There's a healthy balance between meeting the requirements and adhering to those policies and procedures without compromising the well-being of your clients and without compromising your own personal and professional ethics in the process. Max Weber suggested that bureaucracy is supposed to help us be more efficient. It's actually supposed to help take out the arbitrary nature of decisions and allow for some objectivity and some structure and continuity. But we know that bureaucracy also creates these power dynamics and control, and it can depersonalize and maybe even dehumanize the work that we do. And it can also create a situation where we're treating people as objects instead of as human beings. And whenever we depersonalize circumstances and situations and we're making decisions based on authority, robots, rules, regulations because we are told to, and then that poses huge risk to society as a whole. And there's been research. Milgram actually did a study that it's the famous shock study in the field of psychology, where he looked at what influences people's decision to actually impose harm on another human being. And he had participants come in and they were told to shock another human being. And he was looking at varying circumstances under which that person would go ahead and shock them, and at what point they might say no. And what he found was when authority figures were telling them to shock people, they were more likely to shock people. The closer the proximity they were to the authority figure, the more likely they were to follow through. The more they were distant and separated from the individual being shocked, the more likely they were to follow through and harm them. And so this study was inspired by the Holocaust. And, you had all these German Nazi soldiers who just blindly followed their orders and in the process massacred millions of people and engaged in genocide. And at what point Are we going to have people in those positions stand up and say, I don't care if my boss told me to do this, this is wrong. I don't care if this is the rule, this is wrong. Zimbardo conducted a similar study where this was the Stanford prison study, where he assigned participants to either the role of someone imprisoned or the role of the guard overseeing people in prison. And what he found was that people assigned to the role of guard and when they're, in these uniform roles, they actually are more likely to be abusive toward those for which they're entrusted to oversee. In fact, the study got to the point where the prisoners, or the individuals assigned to the role of prison guard were being so abusive, they had to stop. And so all of these studies and history as a whole shows that when you depersonalize it, when you put us into roles just doing jobs, following those regulations and following that bureaucracy, we actually are more likely to do harm to other human beings. So we have to have the courage as human service workers, as social workers, to be advocates. And sometimes that means advocating against the very system and structure in which we operate. Sometimes that means saying, no, I am not going to follow this rule or process because it is doing harm to the clients that I am ethically bound to support and serve. And so again, you are placed in very difficult situations, and you have to examine your own values and traits and decide whether or not that's something you want to live with on an ongoing basis as a professional. So here's some guidance. Rhodes suggested that what we can do as we're navigating these bureaucracies is speak out. Speak out if there's beliefs or politics behind processes and policies. Speak up, point out the inconsistencies, shed light on, call attention to the problems. Look at the underlying politics. Draw attention. You are a voice. You are a voice for society. You are an advocate. So speak up. Additionally, align with your colleagues. Form appropriate alliances with your colleagues, with other social organizations. You want to take actions and drive policy decisions. Some of the most influential social workers are those that are actually advocates at a macro level. So they're lobbying for legislation. They are working for advocacy and human rights organizations. They're policy social workers. They are often working with alliances. So be informed about what legislative issues are happening, certainly that affect your field, your specific area of expertise, but the field at large and society as a whole, and get involved. Additionally, look at the rationale. You're often told, well, this is how we do it, right? Well, this is the policy, but why? Why is it the policy? What's the rationale or logic or reasoning behind that policy? Maybe that logic made sense at one point, but no longer holds true anymore, right? We don't want to just continue to follow protocols that were implemented under a different set of norms and circumstances that are no longer appropriate today. Look for ways that we can promote legislative change, policy change, and make sure we're continuously reviewing those policies and regulations, and that we're maintaining current policies and regulations and laws that make sense for current societal norms and that protect the best interest of humans. We have so many things on the books that that no longer align with our current values as a society. And so we need to be willing to engage in these courageous conversations and the process by which we need to change. Make sure you're offering your expertise. Where can you share your experiences and your background in a way that's valuable and helps to support the need and growth of society as a whole? And also go back to the mission, value, and visions that drive your organization and you as a whole, right? I think it's important to have your own mission, vision, and values, right? Have your own value statements and your own vision statements. Let those guide you as an individual, and choose organizations that have shared values. And in that way, we can make sure that we're not just beholden to bureaucracy, but we're actually doing things that align with our sense of purpose, our sense of passion, and our sense of meaning in life. So another thing that I'm going to go back to and keep reminding you of throughout the course is making client-centered decisions, right? Is the client, the family, the youth at the core of your decision making? They are our employer, right? And when we are making decisions that support their growth, that support their self-actualization and achievement and success, then we can be confident in the ethics of the decisions that we're making, even when it's not clear-cut. When we are promoting the benefit of these individuals and the community at large, then we're doing the good work of our field and our profession. And some ways that you can do that is you can engage in community-based decision-making processes. You can invite the community into the decisions you're making. If you're in a leadership position and you have the opportunity to invite clients to serve on advisory boards, or even your board of trustees or your board of directors, when you can incorporate peer advocates into your structure, into your day-to-day operations, or into an advisory position, when you can make sure you're incorporating different strategies and tools to continuously collect client data, collect data and surveys from your clients so you can see what you're doing right or where is there opportunity for growth. Continuously evaluate, how can I consistently improve? And if you're not listening to the client voice in that evaluation, then you're not going to be able to be the best organization you can be, or the best individual professional you can be, right? So research has shown that when we do collect data from clients, they consistently report 2 factors that contribute to their sense of success in a helping relationship. Was that professional friendly? Was it a personalized, human-centered relationship? Did they feel supported? Did they feel like that person was kind, that that person had a personal interest in them? So it goes back to one of our earlier lessons, you need to build a trusting relationship. For the client, it might look like a friendship, right? Or it just looks like you being a friendly, kind, decent person. For you, it's different than how you might have friendships versus your professional relationships, but both are grounded in empathy, compassion, support. Both are humanized. And then the second factor is, are you providing down-to-earth assistance? Is it practical, logical? Are you giving them the tools they need in their everyday lives to be successful in that journey? Are you giving them resources that help them make good decisions or help them achieve important tasks needed to address whatever the dilemma is in your specialty area? Another tool that you can utilize is this therapeutic alliance or this working alliance framework. So in this framework, we talk about the importance of that interpersonal connection and relationship and how it serves as a foundation, right? So we have 3 elements that help assure successful outcomes with ourselves and the client. Number 1, we have to have a shared goal. What is it that we're achieving? Are we both on the same page? And this goes back to maybe establishing those contracts with clients, having clearly defined roles, goals, breaking those goals down into sub-goals, right? Do we have a shared task? Like, how are we achieving this together, right? And it doesn't mean we have to be doing the exact same thing, but we might have different subtasks within that overarching task or goal. And do we have a relationship that is healthy and connected enough to allow us to achieve that goal? Are we at odds with one another? Are we conflicting with one another? Do we not trust one another or support one another such that we can't work in a healthy, constructive way to achieve that task together? And so make sure you're constantly evaluating all the data that's available to you about the client, from the client, with the client, and you're implementing, client-based, consumer-based decisions or plans. Sometimes we in our field are dealing with these, we're kind of stuck in at odds, or maybe we're in a transition period or in limbo, or maybe we feel like boomerang sometimes because of the national conflicts and national conversations that are happening. And we have to come back to assessing those contradicting values, right? Our nation in some ways has these very democratic humanitarian values that are built and sewn into our Constitution. But then we have this Protestant work ethic that says, you got to work hard, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. That's what determines your success. Well, not everybody has boots. Not everybody has straps in their boots. We have different access to different resources, right? So sometimes even with the greatest work ethic, we face so many barriers that we just keep getting knocked down and knocked down and knocked down. Social Darwinism says then that only the strongest survive. And so if you keep getting knocked down and you can't pull yourself back up, then that's you, right? Then it's survival of the fittest. But then we know that society disadvantages some and advantages others. And we know that there's these power and privilege dynamics at play. So does that really work? You have this individualistic value where it's, self-responsibility and my individual success, and I'm responsible for me. But then at the same time, I have this collectivist value that talks about, no, we have this community connection and this other-centered approach where we all are affected by you and your actions. And so therefore, we have to look at more of the collective benefit, collective needs, and work to focus on how can we support society overall and not just one individual thriving and succeeding. We have competition associated with the individualistic approach. Community is at the center of the collectivist approach and those values, and those are often at odds with one another. Maybe it's some combination thereof. But these larger cultural values, these larger conflicts that exist in our nation as a whole, they shape our cultural values, and it shapes our individual biases and perceptions. And all of that impacts how we direct our resources as a nation, impacts the services that we make available. It might even be impacting our individual views and how we're distributing what resources we're in charge of distributing and services we're in charge of providing. So be mindful of your own biases, your own values, how those are guiding and impacting your role and duties in the work that you do, as well as being mindful of the larger values at play. Some of the ways in which these national conflicts have impacted us in human services is, for instance, the welfare system, right? We have this progressive legislation that puts it into effect, but then there's punitive legislation as well that limits or restricts it or establishes this national poverty level that's really inhumane for people to live at, or it puts so much restrictions and it forces you to live below the poverty line. So we don't help people help themselves. We almost limit people and restrict people with the way in which we manage these programs. Additionally, recipients are more stigmatized here than in other developing countries. We have politicized it to such a degree, and we talk about these entitlement programs, and it's entitlement and stigmatized when it comes to poor people getting financial benefits and support. but we don't stigmatize and refer to it as entitlement when we have corporate welfare in place, right? And I think we've talked about that before. Or mental illness, right? Where that's also stigmatized in society, and we view it as somehow they're inferior, or they're not a strong individual, or it's a character issue. They need to suck it up and get over it, or maybe it's a sign that they're evil in some faiths, right? And I'm being punished for evil deeds or something of that nature. And all of these misconceptions and belief systems cause us to have a negative view of individuals, and therefore they may not be getting the resources they need to be successful or to get the help that they need. It's interesting to see there's actually a greater chance of recovery in less developed countries. And you think, well, that's odd. We have the best resources and medicine available than other countries. But we also put so much on the individual. Those individualistic values are reflected in how we treat people. In these other countries where they might have more deterministic causes, where I think things outside of myself or external causes contribute to my circumstance and my mental health, then I'm not blaming the individual. I'm not stigmatizing the individual. I'm not looking at it as their fault or their responsibility to get better. And then additionally, I might be more sympathetic. I might be more supportive and compassionate toward that individual when I don't look at it as their fault that they're in that situation. Another thing is, in these societies, they believe it's curable. And when you believe, particularly for mental health, when you believe you can get better, guess what? It increases your likelihood of getting better. When you believe you're going to die, guess what? It increases your probability of dying, because it influences how proactive you're going to be in getting healthy and getting better. So what we think, and that's what we call self-fulfilling prophecy, what we think the outcome is going to be influences the outcome directly. Indirectly, because it influences the actions we take, the attitudes we have, and the actions we take. But also just overall, because it might actually influence our access to resources, right? We have to believe that there's opportunity and hope. We have different views about aging in this society. In American society, there's a lot of ageism. In other cultures, they value the elderly and the wisdom that they bring. In Hawaiian culture, we value the kupuna, we value their knowledge and wisdom. We honor them and prize them, right? In US society, we value youth and attractiveness and productivity, and looking at my gray hair, I might be judged, or they might assume that I'm older or less capable cognitively or physically. Whereas in other cultures, they see my gray hair and they think, oh, that's a woman that brings wisdom, experience, and value to conversations, to circumstances. So those national values influence how we might treat our elderly, how we might set up systems and structures to support the elderly, because it influences and drives those underlying implicit beliefs we have about them. Sexual orientation, again, homophobia is ingrained in us in the US society, where somehow we have this inherent fear, ignorance about individuals with diverse sexual identities. And we might even have this ingrained sense of, what's normal and what's not normal. Heteronormativity is this misconception that heterosexuality is normal and anything else is abnormal. It might be statistically more common, but one is not normal or the other. Homosexuality for many years was in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the DSM. That's how we diagnose mental illness. It was in the DSM as a mental illness, and it wasn't until 1973 that it was taken out. And that has kind of transitioned society into being a little bit more accepting of diverse sexual identities. And they're less stigmatized now than they were decades ago, but there's still so much work to be done, and their identities are still very much being attacked. And those individuals still very much face discrimination in the workplace, at school, even at home within their own families. So we also have to think about how our values are influenced by tragedy, by trauma, and how we respond to those traumas are influenced by those national values. For instance, we saw a lot of xenophobia after 9/11, and we saw a lot of people attacking individuals of differing religious faiths, particularly the Muslim community. There was a lot of prejudice against individuals who had, a Swana identity or a Southwest Asian identity, Middle Eastern as you might know it, or Arabic identity as you might know it. And so there was a lot of patriotism that emerged from that, but was it in healthy ways? Do we really value freedom of religion, or do we only value freedom of Christianity? Are we willing to sacrifice the rights of others in the name of national security? So these are all things that impact, you know, these huge moral dilemmas and social conflicts. So I will say we have to have, I've given you a couple of frameworks. We have to have things that help guide us, because there's so many conflicts we will continue to face, not only that we are facing, but we will continue to face in our profession. We have to have guidelines for us. And Professor Frederick Reamer suggests that if we have respect for the dignity and worth of the person as an individual, if we respect individual differences, cultural and ethnic diversity, and we respect confidentiality, then we are going to be able to make better decisions as a human services professional. But those all have limits, right? That if the safety and well-being of individuals or others is at risk, then obviously it's going to cause us to make different decisions, right? We have to weigh those values and those challenges and the adverse impact of the decisions that we're making in people's lives, and we have to do our very best to make healthy, well-rounded, reasoned decisions. So this is our last tool, is this inclusive model of ethical decision making, where we want to have 4 principles and values that guide us. These pillars: accountability to ourselves, accountability to our clients, accountability to agencies, and accountability to society and our profession, right? You are accountable to the human services profession, to the social work profession. Those broader ethics have to guide you, right? If we allow consultation to guide us, where we're consulting the data, consulting the research, consulting our colleagues, consulting our clients, we're gathering information to make informed decisions. If we allow cultural sensitivity to guide us, where we're looking at our culture and how that's shaping and influencing us, but we're also sensitive to our clients' culture and how our decisions might impact their ability to honor their values. We're also looking at how their culture might contribute to who they are and the circumstances in which they find themselves, and we're showing some compassion and understanding about those diverse circumstances. And then we're critically reflecting on all of the information available to us and all of the complexity that contributes to those circumstances. Those principles and values guiding the way in which we do our job and assess circumstances is going to ground us, right? It's going to help offer us some light to navigate ourselves through these very muddy waters. Those principles then will help you engage in a 5-step process. Number 1, where you're clearly defining the ethics in any situation. You're identifying and recognizing the bias at play within yourself, within your client, within the situation. You're recognizing the contrary ethics and the rights and conflicting and competing needs that are involved in those circumstances, where you're actually mapping legitimacy and decision making. And what that means is you're identifying who has the right to make those decisions. What are the roles that we play? Where might our decision making be restricted? Why do those restrictions need to be there? How can we promote collective decision making as best as possible? How can we promote client autonomy and self-determination as best as possible? What are we doing to gather information? Are we gathering all the information available? Are we engaging in due diligence? Are we making sure we have thorough, complete case histories, evidence, documentation? Have we researched all possible information about the situation, including alternative approaches, where we're not trying to just solve everything with what we know is most readily accessible or what's worked in the past, but we're looking at individual alternatives and options for each individual client circumstance. And we're critically analyzing that situation, making the best decision, and then evaluating that decision. Was it the best decision? What was the outcome? What contributed to the outcome? How could I have made a different decision? What information did I need that I did not have? What other information may be available now that wasn't available then? Or what information was available then but I neglected to get? And we need to use that evaluation then to now inform the process by which we make other decisions in the future, to now inform our assessment of ourselves and our client situation, so we can make better decisions moving forward that are grounded in healthy, enriching collective values for ourselves and our clients. I hope all that makes sense. That's the close of chapter 5. I know I was a bit wordy and lengthy, but hey, it's professional ethics, right? How can we not have a little bit more robust conversation and lecture about such an important topic? I'm going to go back to the theme for this module. And although Steve Jobs was talking about, finding a job and a career that you love, right? And this may not on the surface seem like it relates to ethics. It very much does. Because these ethical challenges in which we find ourselves, they burn us out. They take a toll on our spirits, on our sense of well-being sometimes, right? Where we might feel at odds. We might feel icky, and we may not like our jobs. And I'm going to have you go back to grounding yourself in your purpose and your passion for the work that you do. I'm going to have you go back after you're feeling like, oh, this is an impossible situation. Re-ground yourself in your purpose and your passion. Remember the love for the job. Remember the love for the people that you serve. Let that be a guide for you as you face these impossible situations. Again, do the best that you can. Serve the people the best that you can. Be true to your own ethics. Be true to your professional ethics. And know that you are doing everything in your power to make client-centered decisions that make that life better and make the world better at large. Aloha.